For more on Iran and the other news this week, we turn to our panel. Again, we're joined by Margaret Brennan, our State Department correspondent, David Ignatius, a columnist for The Washington Post. We welcome Ruth Marcus, also a Post columnist, and Jeffrey Goldberg, a national correspondent for The Atlantic. Welcome all. Let's turn back to the issue of Iran, Jeffrey. I mean, is it possible that the rift between the U.S. and Israel is even larger now?
Well, there's an interesting moment coming up because I think the president, right after this framework agreement was announced, did a couple of things. He immediately reached out to the Gulf states, to the Arabs, and he immediately reached out to Benjamin Netanyahu. Now remember, that's not his favorite thing to do during the day, is make long, involved phone calls to Benjamin Netanyahu, but he did it, and they're going to be talking in the coming days and weeks about strengthening the defense relationship between Israel and the United States. So I think the White House is cognizant of the fact that they have to work with their Middle East allies to make them feel somewhat elate about this, and also it's good politics for the White House, because if you give the Arabs something, if you give the Israelis something, maybe then their objections to this deal will be somewhat more muted.
What do we have to give them?
We can do various things to ensure for Israel. Obviously, it's making sure that their qualitative military edge is maintained. Various other sort of security guarantees and close cooperation. The Israelis feel, or the Israeli government at least feels, that the U.S. is drifting away from it, or the Obama administration is drifting away. So now is the time to sort of stitch back together.
Let's take a look at this recent tweet from the Israeli Prime Minister. It's a map of the region with arrows from Iran leading to Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, and Yemen, the title being Iran's aggression during the nuclear negotiations. I mean, that's one of the criticisms, Margaret, is this didn't deal anything with Iran's funding a lot of these proxy groups in these and being a chief destabilizer.
Right, and Secretary Muniz was unable to answer your question about that, of, this windfall for Iran financially, how do you control where the money goes, which is a big question that people can't quite answer. But what the administration would say is, well, we are keeping other sanctions on Iran as it relates to human rights abuses, et cetera, and that at the UN, some of the biggest embargoes, like on arms, will still be maintained, so we have some lever of control there. But, it's interesting, I interviewed Secretary Kerry right after he unveiled this deal or announcement, framework for an announcement for a deal, possibly some would say. And he responded in a way that just suggested the Israeli criticism was Pavlovian. They're going to say this regardless, and it's not based on fact. And I think as the administration makes its argument to Congress, they're going to rely more and more on the science of it. I think we'll be seeing more and more of Secretary Muniz as sort of the credibility for the administration and arguing the science of this, and lean more and more on that, because they are dismissing the rhetoric coming from Israel as rhetoric.
I know certainly the administration is trying to make that case. Let's look at the science of this. I also want to just step back for a moment about this being really a moment for President Obama, who has spent reportedly more time on Iran than almost any other issue in terms of foreign policy. Does he have any foreign policy legacy without getting something on Iran?
This is without question the biggest thing he has tried to do. He said it from his inaugural address in January 2009. He specifically reached out to Iran, said he sought an engagement based on mutual respect and mutual interest.
Their fist, yeah.
And now, 6 years later, here we are with this tentative deal, a deal that has struck many observers in the U.S. as a little better than expected. The reaction to Israel is a little less angry than expected. Many Iranians are jubilant at the end of their isolation. So he can say, the biggest thing I try to do in foreign policy, I am succeeding at. And I think that's important politically. It's important for him in terms of his legacy. Hillary Clinton was a key part of making this secret diplomacy work in the beginning. So she's part of it too. And I think it's going to be tough for the Republicans to run hard against this if the elements that are now shaky in the deal can be firmed up in a way that looks like they constrain Iran more.
Ruth, I took a look at just about every potential Republican presidential candidate for 2016, and all of them were very critical of this deal.
Well, I think that the real legacy question is not going to be answered during the 2016 campaign, and I think David said the critical word, which is if they can reach this agreement by June, if Iran abides by the deal, assuming that the deal goes through, and if it turns out that it's not unleashing a destabilizing force in the region by either giving Iran more money or impelling the arms race with other neighbors, then it could affect President Obama's long-term foreign policy legacy, because right now it looks very, very messy. If he has solved this Iran problem, or at least improved the Iran problem, we could then look back on him as having opened real relationships with two important countries that we did not have relationships with at the start, one being Cuba, the second being Iran. But in the short term, in 2016, it is going to be a partisan battle along the lines that Senator Graham was suggesting.
Mm-hmm. Jeffrey, you talked about the president and his relationship with these Gulf states. I mean, he's trying to convene, quite frankly, which would be not a summit, but I mean this incredible gathering of leaders from Saudi Arabia, from Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE. Forgive me if I'm leaving off one of them off the top of my head, but what is it, an effort by the president to show unity? Does he really have some convincing to do? Does he have to sell some of them some new advanced weaponry, as has been suggested to me?
They get a lot of pretty advanced weaponry already, so I don't know how much of a sale it is. But no, it's a reassurance meeting. It's a meeting to convince people that he's not actually shifting American focus to Iran, trying to make Iran the principal stabilizer of the Middle East, but that we're still friends with the Arabs. And a very important part of this, he is trying to convince these Arab states, look, you don't have to go down the nuclear path yourselves because we've got your back. Again, it's all about trying to convince the Saudis not to go to their friends in Pakistan and buy some nuclear weapons, to put it bluntly, because then you have what President Obama has described as a nightmare. So now is the time to reassure all of America's allies in the Middle East, and that's what he's doing in a rather dramatic way at Camp David.
And I think it's in some ways tacit recognition of something the administration has tried to ignore or deny, which is they say this nuclear deal with Iran is not connected in any way to anything else in the Middle East as a portfolio. Right. It's totally siloed. And yet it is inextricably linked to every country and every conflict in the Middle East. Yeah. And so those conversations need to be had. But I think one interesting development in the past few weeks is also to see what Saudi Arabia has chosen to do in Yemen, and what many of the other Arab countries have chosen to go along with them on, which is essentially some kind of Arab response force, right? There's no shortage of weapons, but there's been a shortage of choices to use those weapons.
One of the things that the Arab states are going to be asking for is a little bit more assertiveness on the part of the United States against Iran in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon.
There's one other ball I think we need to be keeping our eye on, because it's not just a selling job that the president needs to do with Arab states and with Israel. It's a selling job with Congress. So after this Easter recess, Congress is going to come back. The Senate has been asserting its role. The administration would well prefer it to say, oh, well, you're the commander-in-chief, you're the chief force in foreign policy. We'll just sit back, and whatever you want us to do with the sanctions, fine, we'll go along. The administration is understanding that's not the way it's going to work. Congress is going to assert its role. It has started to do, and it knows it needs to do, a serious selling job with Congress, because this Corker bill is going to come up that is going to require a congressional role in undoing the congressional end of the sanctions, and that's an important piece to watch, including the fact that Senator Schumer, the soon-to-be, not that soon, but waiting Senate Minority Leader in waiting, has signed on to this bill that would assert the congressional role. So keep an eye on that.